It didn't begin with a lawsuit or a leaked memo. It began with a sentence. Short, public, impossible to walk back. When Elon Musk spoke this time, it wasn't another provocation tossed into the digital void. It was a declaration that landed like a fracture line beneath Europe's political architecture. What followed was not outrage, but panic. Not debate, but mobilization. Because for the first time, the challenge wasn't coming from a rival government or a hostile power. It was coming from a man who controlled the infrastructure of modern speech. Across Europe, officials were used to managing dissent quietly. They regulated platforms, fined companies, pressured executives behind closed doors. The system depended on predictability. CEOs always negotiated. Tech giants always complied. Musk did neither. He went public, framed the conflict in moral terms, and dared the European Union to enforce its authority in full view of the world. What made it dangerous wasn't the criticism. Europe had survived criticism before. What made it dangerous was the framing. Musk didn't argue about technical compliance or legal nuance. He questioned legitimacy itself. He drew a line between Europe as a civilization and Brussels as a machine, and millions instantly understood the difference. Culture versus control, identity versus administration, people versus process. Inside EU institutions, the response was swift and instinctive. This was not a conversation to be allowed to spread. If left unchecked, it could metastasize into something far larger than one platform. It could invite other leaders, other companies, other citizens to question where authority actually resided. And so the system did what it always did. It reached for regulation. The Digital Services Act was not designed for negotiation. It was designed for obedience. Presented publicly as a safety measure, it carried within it a far more potent function. The power to compel platforms to internalize Brussels priorities as their own, to convert private systems into extensions of regulatory will. And now it had a target. The ultimatum arrived without ceremony. Comply or pay, not just with money, but with access, transparency, and ultimately subordination. Algorithms demanded. Moderation, overseers imposed. A permanent presence inside the machinery of speech itself. It was not enough for X to follow the rules. It had to become the rules. From Brussels, the outcome seemed inevitable. Every major platform before had resisted, negotiated, and eventually folded. Power, after all, resides with those who can deny access to markets. That assumption had held for decades, until it didn't. Thousands of miles away, the atmosphere could not have been more different. No marble halls, no diplomatic language. Just engineers, lawyers, and a clock that refused to slow down. Musk didn't treat the ultimatum as a fine. He treated it as a siege. And instead of fortifying the walls, he mapped the exits. The plan was radical not because it was loud, but because it was final, not partial compliance, not staged resistance. A full withdrawal, clean, immediate, legally airtight. If Europe wanted to control the platform, it would have to do so without the platform itself. This wasn't posturing. The teams knew what it meant. The millions of users disconnected, political discourse disrupted overnight. Journalists, activists, emergency networks cut loose from the system they had come to depend on. The consequences would be enormous. But Musk believed something even larger was at stake. If one government succeeded in embedding itself inside a digital public square, others would follow. One censor would become many. One overseer would become a template. The internet would fracture not by accident, but by design. And to Musk, that was a line that could not be crossed. Brussels misread the moment. It believed the threat of exclusion would be enough. That public pressure would turn opinion. That fear would do the work. But something else was happening. The more forcefully the system responded, the clearer its nature became. This was no longer about safety. It was about who decides what can be said. When the next fine was announced, aimed not at content, but at status itself, the mask slipped completely. Verification. Once the domain of elites had been flattened, a symbolic equalizer, and that equality was intolerable because power depends not only on rules, but on hierarchy. And hierarchy had just been challenged in plain sight. As deadlines approached, the tension spread beyond institutions. Ordinary users began to understand what was being risked. Not an app, A space, a place where narratives collide without permission, where authority is questioned in real time. And suddenly, the threat of disappearance felt personal. Brussels had gambled on compliance. What it faced instead was defiance with consequences, and then the conflict escaped Europe entirely. The turning point did not come from within Europe. It arrived from outside the framework entirely, carried by a shift in global posture that Brussels could not regulate, fine, or ignore. What had begun as a regulatory standoff was suddenly reclassified as a geopolitical confrontation. And in that arena, rules mattered far less than leverage. Washington had been watching quietly, not with the moral language Europe favoured, but with strategic calculation. The message that emerged was stripped of diplomacy. Control over speech platforms was no longer considered a domestic technical matter. It was a matter of influence, reach, and precedent. If one bloc could dictate the internal mechanics of an American-owned platform, others would follow. And the consequences would not stop at Europe's borders. Statements gave way to action, not symbolic condemnations, but moves designed to send a signal that could not be misinterpreted. Access was revoked. Doors closed. Individuals who had built their careers enforcing norms suddenly found themselves outside the perimeter of power they assumed was permanent. The shock inside Brussels was immediate. This was not the response they had prepared for. The assumption had always been that escalation would isolate the company, not the regulators. That pressure would move in one direction only. That belief collapsed overnight. The system that relied on inevitability discovered its vulnerability. Authority that cannot enforce itself universally ceases to be authority at all. Inside Europe, the consequences multiplied. Public anger surged. Not because people understood every technical detail, but because they understood the pattern. Decisions made without consent, rules imposed without accountability, punishment delivered without recourse. The confrontation with Musk had become a mirror reflecting a deeper unease that had been building for years. The Commission's language softened. Words like cooperation and responsibility replaced certainty, but the damage was done. When power retreats rhetorically, it exposes fear. And fear invites challenge. What Brussels faced now was not one opponent, but many. Other platforms watched closely. So did national governments. If one actor could resist and survive, others could too. The logic of centralized control depends on isolation. The moment resistance becomes contagious, enforcement unravels. Musk did not declare victory. He didn't need to. The system had revealed itself. That was enough. The narrative had shifted from compliance to choice, from regulation to consent, from inevitability to contingency. Europe stood at a junction it could no longer avoid. One path led deeper into managed speech, layered oversight, and expanding bureaucratic reach. A vision of order maintained through systems that answer only to themselves. The other path was far less tidy, messy, unpredictable, decentralized. But it placed agency back where it had quietly been stripped away. The conflict exposed a truth that could no longer be suppressed. Power in the digital age does not belong exclusively to states or corporations. It belongs to whoever controls the channels through which people speak, organize, and decide. And that power cannot be fully centralized without resistance. For decades, Europe's institutions had operated on momentum, expanding authority incrementally, assuming legitimacy would follow structure. That assumption no longer held. Legitimacy, once lost, cannot be legislated back into existence. As the dust settled, one fact remained undeniable. The confrontation had permanently altered the balance, not because a platform won or a regulator lost, but because the illusion of total control had shattered. The system blinked, and once that happens, it can never claim inevitability again. The future of Europe's digital landscape was no longer pre-written. It would be contested, negotiated, fought over in public view, and that, more than any fine or law, terrified those accustomed to quiet authority. The story does not end with resolution. It ends with a question that no institution can answer on behalf of its people. Who decides the limits of speech in a connected world? Who holds the keys to the public square? And whether control, once exposed, can ever fully return to the shadows? Europe now stands in that moment of choice, not between platforms, but between models of power, between governance by consent and governance by enforcement. The The decision will not be announced. It will unfold slowly, silently, and with consequences that will define the next era. Because once a system is forced to reveal how it rules, it can never rule the same way again.